Welcome to the 6th installment of the Roxborough Roundtables. My name is Jessica Putman, and I'm the student coordinator for the Roundtables. Our topic today is Life on the Registry, PA's new sex offender law. Does it protect the children? Our host today is Professor Cheri Brooks.
Thank you, Jess. My name is Cheri Brooks. I'm a teacher here at Philadelphia University. I teach law, women, and gender. I also teach ethical issues in criminal justice at Drexel University. And I'm a public defender. I'm a practicing lawyer. I'd like to introduce the panel. We have, from left to right, Maureen Belwar, who's a student at Drexel University, majoring in criminal justice. We have Tricia Miller, who's a student who's majoring in psychology at Philadelphia University. We have Stacy Van Dam, who's a professor of English literature at Philadelphia University. And we have Jessica Putman, who's also a student at Philadelphia University majoring in law and society. So with that, I think we'll start. We decided to do a discussion of Megan's Law, specifically the more modern name for the law, which is SORNA, and that stands for Sex Offender Registration and Notification Act. Many people think of Megan's Law, it's associated with a girl named Megan. Her name is Megan Kenka, and in 1994 she was brutally kidnapped and raped and killed by a neighbor in New Jersey who had been convicted in the past of a sex offense, and her parents didn't know that he was living right next door to them, very close to them. So the thought was that if people know that there are sex offenders living near them, they can protect their children from such people. And clearly the person that did that to Megan Kenka was a true monster. And in fact, he ended up being sentenced to death. He would fall into the category of the worst of the worst. So we can understand the impetus to start passing Megan's Law type statutes, the laws that are named after Megan. The first one was passed in 1990, actually, in Washington before the tragedy of Megan. But after that happened, there was many states, in fact all states, started passing Megan's laws that were modeled after those other statutes. And over the years they became more and more inclusive, including more statutes, mostly focusing on violent type crimes, rape and sexual assault crimes. And the idea was that if someone was convicted of such a crime, they would have to register with the state police, and their name and photograph would have to appear on a website. Every time they changed their address or changed their place of work, they would have to let the state police know. So that way, society could keep track of such individuals. And you can understand sort of the reasoning behind such laws. The idea is that sex offenders are more likely to recidivize, are more likely to commit future type crimes of the same sort. And so therefore, society's need to protect itself from such people would outweigh the privacy rights that such people would enjoy. In 2006, the federal government passed a law called the Adam Walsh Act, Child Protection and Safety Act. And Adam Walsh was another child who was brutally killed and sexually assaulted. So that law is named after him. Part of that act, it basically, in the federal context, had much more stringent registration requirements. And part of the law said that in order to get some federal funding, states had to come into compliance with that much more stringent law. So Pennsylvania in 2011 passed its version of the Adam Walsh Act called SORNA. And what SORNA does is it significantly, it imposes much broader requirements. There's more laws that are required. There's more laws or more crimes that are included under the convictions under which someone would have to register. For instance, indecent assault is a misdemeanor offense that wasn't part of Megan's Law in Pennsylvania and is now part of the law under SORNA.
Can I ask you a question,
Yes.
Professor Zevenway? What is indecent assault?
Well, indecent assault is, and I'm just going to answer that by describing two cases that I tried that involved indecent assaults. And I tried them in municipal court because they were misdemeanors. One involved a man who was accused of kissing a woman on the cheek. He ran a store, and a customer came into a store, and he kind of leaned over and kissed her on the cheek. And he was charged with indecent assault. Another case involved a man who's kind of homeless and mentally ill, and as a FedEx employee, a female FedEx employee, walked past him going into a building, he patted her on the behind. So those types of crimes are indecent assault. So if those, fortunately both of those defendants were actually found not guilty, but if they had been found guilty, they would have been required under SORNA to register for 10 years as a sex offender.
So I just understand it, and anyone wants to comment whether they think this is fair or not. If this person lived next to me, do they have to tell the neighbors that they've actually are registered?
They don't have. There's different levels of registry. There's 3 tiers. So there's tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. The indecent assault would be a tier 1 offense. So they wouldn't have to go around and tell their neighbors. It wouldn't. I mean, I don't think anyone has to go around and tell their neighbors because no one really wants a sex offender coming to their door. But there would have to be notification, maybe by letters or by pamphlets or flyers, something of that sort. They would just have to be on the registry, on the website. And you can go to the website and look people up, your neighbors up if you want. And they would only have to register for a tier 1 offense for 10 years. No, for 15 years. I'm sorry, it's gone up with SORNA. 15 years. Tier 2 is 25 years, and tier 3 is life. Tier 3 are considered sexually violent predators, and there's an evaluation process that goes into determining who is a quote-unquote sexually violent predator. So I'm going to turn this over to Jess because she had some, you looked at some of the requirements that sex offenders have to abide by, who are convicted of crimes like this under SORNA.
Yes, so I'm Jessica. Mm-hmm. For criminals who register under SORNA, there's like a lot of rules and regulations that they have to abide by, especially when it comes to children and people under the age of 18 years old. Some of the rules are like really strict, especially like if you're a tier 1 offender, like say if the case where the guy kissed the girl on the cheek, that might just be part of his culture and not seen as, to him, as a problem. That's just how you greet someone. To her, she took offense to it, and that's why she pressed charges. But if he was found guilty and had to register on the list, he's not allowed, let's say he had a family with kids, he's not allowed to be around his kids no more because he's a registered sex offender. And that's like endangerment of his kids. There's other rules that requires him where he cannot write, talk, touch, send text messages, communicate, even a wave or just like a glance, like a wink or something. Even if it's an involuntary, it's still seen as going against your conditions for your parole and everything like that once you register for SORNA. Now, I could not find, and I wanted to know if you would know this, Cheryl, if when they register on SORNA, does it tell you exactly what they did, or does it just say they're a sex offender?
I think it tells you what they did.
It does?
Yeah.
Will it just say...
It won't say the facts of the case.
Okay.
Because obviously the victims have to be protected, but it will say the crime.
So even if it was the guy who gave the kiss on the cheek, it wouldn't say, oh, all he did was give some lady a kiss on the cheek.
No.
It would just say he's a sex offender, basically.
It would say he was convicted of indecent assault. Marissa?
Would it mention whether or not it would be a crime against a minor? Does that change it?
Yes, that does change it.
If he was 18 and she was 16, would he still be, if you didn't get him off, could he be responsible for indecent sexual assault?
Well, that's a good point because that is another addition that SORNA has brought onto the people that must register. And it used to be that certain crimes that were considered sex crimes weren't on the list of those that had to be registered. But A new one is statutory sexual assault, which is can be consensual sex between an adult and a minor. And there has to be a certain age difference between them for it to actually count as a crime. I think it's 6 years. Especially if the minor is under a certain age. So it's not like 18 and 16. That's not considered a crime in Pennsylvania. But a slightly wider gap, even if it was consensual, is a crime for which someone has to register.
Let me just follow that up.
Yeah.
Okay, so someone is 17 and 364 days old.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, right before their 18th birthday, and looks older, represents herself as being 22, and is dating a 30-year-old guy, which is not out of the ordinary. It happens.
Right.
And they have consensual relationship. And then her father finds out about it and gets all upset and makes his daughter, or he even, press his charges. Would that person be a sex offender?
Yes. Yes, that person would be a sex offender. Like I said, there has to be a certain age gap between the two parties, and I believe the victim has to be under 16.
The victim would have to be under, in PA, the age of consent is 16.
Yeah.
So after 16, and there's 4 years, it's a 4-year gap. So 16 and 20, 17 and 21.
Right. So 15, let's say 15 and 21. That would be a sex offense for which someone would have to register. And there's 15-year-olds that clearly look like they're older, but that's not a defense to statutory sexual assault.
What happens if the person said, "I'm 18"?
It's not a defense.
So what you have to do is ask for card for identification. What happens if they give you one of the cards they used to go out drinking that has a phony date on it, a phony birthday? That's no offense as well?
I mean, it would be something that, and you're a lawyer, so it sounds like you would make some good defense arguments. And perhaps you would win. I mean, I can't, it's not like there's always defenses, but no, I mean, it's pretty much a strict liability statute. Maureen, because you have more to add about that one?
Well, for that, I mean, they don't take into consideration for the tiers and ranking, like extenuating factors like that. Like if it was a case like that, or if it was actually much wider age gap in which like the older guy was manipulating the younger person, they wouldn't take that into consideration. And
so, yeah, I mean, there's 2 tiers for statutory sex assault. Tier 2 is 8 years older, but less than 11 years older than the complainant. They do have some age ranges that differ. Tier 3 is 11 or more years older than the complainant, and you can understand why that would be considered worse than the other one. But it's not as easy as just 18 and 16 in Pennsylvania, at least just under the statute. But it doesn't, regardless of any voluntary conduct by the victim, that would still be considered something that would constitute a sex offense. And so these are the kinds of issues that come up with SORNA, that there's not on the list, there's just a list of crimes. You're on a website with your crime, and you don't have these extenuating circumstances. And because of the broadness of SORNA, people are considered to be sex offenders, along with those who would, violently and brutally rape someone. So that's the criticism of SORNA by some, in the defense community at least, that it's overly broad, that the net it casts is too wide. So those are kind of the issues I thought we could talk about, just the overbroadness of SORNA and also maybe the underbroadness of SORNA. And Tricia was going to talk about another feminist argument against SORNA and laws like it, and how, I guess the overarching question is, does it keep our communities safer? Because clearly there's people that we want to know about that are out there. But the question is, does this law do that job? And so Tricia had another take on it.
So the feminist argument views rape not just as sex, but also as violence. And it argues that it takes away the autonomy of the victim and also takes away their right to choose. But the law views it more as just sex. So it views for children, if there's 2 different classifications for the perpetrator. So it's considered worse if the perpetrator is a stranger than if they are like a relative or a close member to the family. So they base this upon the risk that it poses to the community. So pretty much the implication of this is that a stranger committing a sex offense against a child is a greater risk to the community than a family member or a close individual to the family. However, incest is 46% of the convictions of rape cases for minors. So technically this probably shouldn't be considered less harmful to the community, but because it's equally as dangerous. Regardless who's committing it, it's still a sex offense against a minor. So they kind of downplayed the abuse in the home, which is a really big problem in society, and it kind of, looking at it, minimizes incest as less dangerous than a sex assault based on a sex assault committed by a stranger.
Yeah, so I always wanted to get 2 points. First of all, I just wanted to have Maureen respond to that, because that argument is basically saying the law is not broad enough. It doesn't prioritize the crimes that actually most people who are assaulted, most children who are assaulted, experience, which is assault in the home, and not in a so-called violent, physically violent context, but certainly emotionally violent. But Maureen kind of has another take on maybe the overbroadness of SORNA relating to crimes against children.
Well, I mean, I think for that particular law, that just doesn't make sense at all. If it's definitely true that if we're going just with that, this should be a law, which I disagree with anyway. But that's just a huge flaw in it, because, I mean, strangers, it's like way less likely for a rape to be done by a stranger. I think it's like a 90% somewhere for like overall. I don't know children in the household, but and then like repeating assaults would probably be more likely if it's like a family member than a stranger. The strangers, then they wouldn't be a stranger. So I think that doesn't make sense for it to be separated like that. But I, in general, disagree with this law's existence, because I think it actually causes more harm than it. I think it's a reactionary law that like we put in place to make us feel better and safer, but it really does the opposite of what its intentions are, which is to protect the public, and it does the opposite of that.
And yeah, Stacey, sorry.
I'm thinking of trying to pull some strands together here, but I don't know if I can do it. One of the statistics that I have is for child sexual abuse, which isn't about rape specifically, but it is true that 90% of those cases are done by someone that the child knows and trusts, and that the family knows and trusts. So that kind of speaks to what Trisha was saying, in terms of a law that kind of makes it worse to be a stranger committing this crime than somebody who's known to commit the crime. And I think this goes back to something we were talking about before when we were kind of preparing for this meeting, about the kind of the narratives that sort of criminalize pedophilia and sex offense in a way that turns the offender into a monster and allows us to kind of like discount to a certain degree that person. So let me go back now and think of how I was going to connect that to what you were saying before. I remember. So earlier also we were talking about how the Megan's Law and SORNA and things like that tend to be, sort of cast too wide of a net. And I think that's part of this problem of criminalizing and sort of monsterizing, these narratives that are based on these people who committed crimes that were really heinous and not on the kind of subtleties and the situations that we've been talking about here. There's this person I found in an article that you linked me to, Cheri. Wesley G. Jennings, assistant professor of criminology at University of South Florida, talks about the collateral consequences for sex offenders as a result of having to register, which is kind of, I think, where we were circling back to. And those include, and this is a quote from his article, residential restrictions, housing instability, limited access to employment opportunities, loss of interpersonal relationships, and difficulty finding social support mechanisms. And I think this is kind of what you're getting at, that in some ways that by criminalizing and sort of over-registering and restricting people so much, they end up sort of excluded and in a position of maybe committing crimes more often than they would if they had a different sort of avenue to resolving the sex crime issue. You know, support, counseling, therapies, things like that.
What I think would be interesting, because we're talking theory, but I'd like to see from the young people here, if they knew, say, you have a young family, you have a young child, which is probably not too far away in the future for you guys, and you would look on the registry and you find out that your next door neighbor is listed as a registered sex offender. And assume you're not law and society students, you're not lawyers, and you didn't hear this broadcast, so you basically hear sex offender. What would be, Jesse, what would be your reaction to that person and your reaction within the neighborhood?
My first reaction to somebody just flat out being a sex offender, I would just automatically think, oh, they either raped somebody or they assaulted a kid. I wouldn't think of something as simple as like a confusion in culture or something along those lines. I will automatically just go to like the worst of the worst if I see sex offender. And then to me, I wouldn't feel comfortable with my child being near my neighbor. But without knowing what the actual different tiers are and the different crimes that that person could have had possibly committed, I would never know like to even ask or even like find out, because maybe it was something that isn't as seen as for me as like terrible and horrible. Like he might not have anything to do with rape or like sexually assaulting kids or anything to do with minors at all. So it's like, why would I want to push him away? But just seeing sex offender and not knowing any of this would automatically be like, he needs to get out of my neighborhood as soon as possible.
Kevin?
I have the complete opposite opinion. I believe like if this person has any sort of confusion of what qualifies as consent, I don't want them anywhere near my family. Like it doesn't matter what they did. If there's any, I don't know, if they don't completely understand how to behave according to societal norms, then I don't want them interacting with him like now.
So you would ostracize this person.
Yes.
You would talk to him or her or whatever. You want nothing. You want the kids having nothing to do with his family.
Ideally.
Or anywhere near his property.
Yeah.
Lauren J.
We learned about someone in my law class in high school from a neighboring town that was put on the sex offender registry because he went to a big school in said town and walking home from a party decided to urinate on a playground. So he was put on for like indecent exposure or whatever. Totally fine dude, just his bladder was full at the wrong place. Yeah. So, I mean, I think it. Going back to your hypothetical, I'm assuming I'm already on the website. I'm gonna take the extra 2 seconds to click on the person's name instead of just looking at their dot and see who the person is. Like maybe you've known them all your life and you're like, oh, that's what he was talking about. Like that stupid thing led to this, or oh yeah, I thought he was sketchy. I don't want that, just solidifies that I don't want my kids near him, or I've never seen him around, I don't go to that part of town, what do I care? Kind of thing.
Well, that just brings up a good point. I wanted to ask Stacy about the one thing that Adam Walsh and SORNA have added to the sex offender registry process are juveniles. So juvenile offenders, for more serious cases, are getting put on the registry. So we're talking about like a 14-year-old boy that is accused of raping someone or sexually assaulting someone. That boy will now have to register for possibly an extended period of time because of the way the law works for juveniles. Jesse?
I kind of have a problem with that because I've seen a lot of articles that flash by on like different news sites and different branches of like where you can get your news from. And some of them are like dealing with teenagers in high school and they get caught doing something. And I'm not saying like she might be right, she might not be. But then later on you see an article that says, oh, I lied because I didn't want to get in trouble. If he was convicted and now he's on the sex offender list, I feel so bad for him because he didn't actually commit the crime. She just said that, oh, this is what happened, just so she wouldn't get in trouble. Because I saw an article where it happened in school. A teacher came around the corner And then she looked up at the teacher and was like, help, he's raping me, and started screaming.
Mm-hmm.
But then later on, it came to find out that she consented to it. Everything was like, they both consented to it. And she just was afraid of going home, getting in trouble by her parents. So she was like, I can claim rape and I wouldn't be in trouble. They would feel bad for me, kind of.
Right.
But if he was convicted and put on a sex offender list, like, how do you know if it's right to just put all juveniles on a sex offenders list in like a time like that? I'm not saying like all cases are the
No,
same.
I'm saying I would assume for that specific case that there are precautions that you could take to get someone like that off the list. I mean, it wouldn't repair the damage
That's already done.
that you mentioned earlier.
I mean, if you could overturn the conviction. Maureen, did you have a comment about that?
Well, I know it's really hard to overturn convictions,
Yeah.
and I think you even have to like pay yourself for your
Mhm.
legal fees if you are like wrongly convicted to get
Yeah.
it taken off. Like you pay for your lawyer, which is just weird and doesn't make sense. And I also wanted to say something about your comment about like you wouldn't want them anywhere near your family. But if the idea, if that's the attitude of the public and we have this list, like how are we treating those people on that list? There's two arguments I think, and one is like compassion for the offender and like having a second chance, because 95% of like these people are gonna, like sex cases are gonna re-enter society, I think is the one I got. So that's a lot of people who are gonna come out into society, and if they're on a list like that and they're treated that way, and then they have things like they're isolated, and like all these risk factors, unemployment, instability, if like they can't stay in one place because people find out who they are.
Aren't they only on for a limited amount of time?
I mean,
Aren't they on the list indefinitely, or?
I think they,
Depending on the crime.
tier and the
Right.
crime.
Sometimes, yeah, the more serious crimes are on for life.
Okay.
But and people assume that sex offenders are like have a high likelihood of reoffending, and there was a study that I read, and it said 5.3% of sex offenders were rearrested for like a new sex crime within 3 years of being released. So that's a low percentage, and the odds of a person being treated in that way, not committing a crime or not like turning to that, I think it like increases the odds. And you said something I think about like when we put this label on people, and like we put them in on the Megan's Law, and like we literally have a list and a map of like all these people, and if you're on that, why? I think it would be hard for someone to not fall into that, being a criminal.
So Maureen has, one thing that's really interesting is she has a model of criminal justice that I think is maybe not so popular, but I think it's growing in popularity, and the idea would be kind of restorative justice, like what heals a community rather than what punishes an offender, and is it more important to heal a community? When you start talking about that with sex offenders, people get really, they have a visceral kind of reaction. In fact, this series in the New York Times that ran recently that talked about pedophiles, like Stacy was saying, saying that it's actually, pedophilia is more of a mental illness, and we should look at it that way, and not all people who have that mental illness act on their impulses, and that we should separate the, action from thoughts, or action from mental illness. That got I think it got more responses than they normally get, in terms of comments. They had to cut the comments off because there were so many negative comments just about the idea that someone who's a pedophile that one could have compassion, or it could be gray. It's not black and white. Not all pedophiles are, monsters.
It seems
or Jerry Sandusky,
Well, there's this quote, I got a quote from an Indiana state senator, again,
Yeah.
same site. Good public policy requires that we look carefully at what we fear. I think the problem is that when we criminalize and sort of like frame someone as a monster and then just put them away into a box somewhere, we're not actually taking a close look at what we fear, and we're not figuring out what created the monster, how to prevent more monster creation. how to prevent more crimes. We're just kind of like compartmentalizing and not dealing with the problem. So I don't think it leads to social healing if we do that. I'm not saying we shouldn't.
Just interrupt for 1
Yeah.
second. I know there's at least 3 parents here. You
Yes,
say
yes.
you have young children, Cheri, you have
Yes.
young children. I have adults, I used to have young children. But I understand what you're saying about the compassion and so forth. But if there was in my town, next to me,
Have
I
you
knew
looked?
someone who posed
Did you look?
when my kids were young, when Megan's didn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
But if they were young when Megan's law exists, without doubt I'd look.
Mm-hmm.
Because the risk is so high. And frankly, I'm speaking as a parent, not as a lawyer, not as someone who teaches criminal justice, but as a parent, I would say, I don't care about their rights. I really don't. That they have forfeited whatever rights they have by committing this heinous act. And if you're going to balance out the rights and health and safety of my children versus this person, it ain't a game, okay? I don't care less. But the problem, we have to define who the pedophiles are and who they are.
Right.
But how do you look at a law through the eyes of a parent? Like that's not what our justice system is. If we chose all of our laws through that lens, I think we'd have a different society. It's not about that. It's about like to protect the public, and also why they are still a citizen when you commit a sex crime, and like that is not just because I don't want care if they're a citizen or not, and I just want to push them in the corner. And we can't have our laws reflecting that attitude.
Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I had something about like the fear of why people group individuals and want to like kind of like put them in a box and push them away. It's because if you are in this room and you're looking at everyone sitting around you, let's say one of us was a sex offender, registered sex offender. Looking at someone who looks just like you, going to school with you, that can be terrifying because it's like anyone that I encounter could be a registered sex offender or something of that nature. Mm-hmm. But if I can literally pick out in the crowd who they are, I feel safer in some sorts because you don't have to live in fear that every single person you encounter is a dangerous criminal. You kind of have an image of what quote unquote evil looks like. Mm-hmm. So it kind of gives you that sense of like, I don't know, comfort in some nature. Mm-hmm. And then on the thing about behaving to a cultural norm, living in America, there's so many different cultures that make up America. It's the simple fact that greeting somebody in a friendly way from France or something is totally different than how we might greet somebody. How a Russian and a German might greet each other are completely different from how me and you might greet each other. So saying that someone should have to conform to something that they think they are conforming to, it's kind of like, you can't really say that. It's like kissing someone on the cheek is a way of showing like, hi, how are you? Like, you're a great friend of mine or something like that. It's a way of greeting somebody. But to us, it's not natural because we've become a culture where it's like, hi, how are you? I'll wave to you. But if they just came from overseas and that's like what they've grown up with, they're not going to like automatically be like, oh, this is wrong. Why? They're going to think we're wrong. You know
What
I'm
about
like,
cultures where there are cultures where actual violence against women is culturally acceptable. So if that person comes here, should we accept that?
Well, I'm not saying that they should go and break laws that we already have in place, but have to be a registered sex offender for a misunderstanding is kind of like extreme to me.
I think it's the misdemeanor part. I don't think we should have Megan's Law for misdemeanors.
Agreed.
I definitely think there should be some sort of way to categorize the violent sex offenders, like the tier 3 it is, right? It's like the worst people, those people. But I think tier 1, like the 2 guys that you were talking about earlier, that's not something to make someone rearrange their whole life over, their
Misunderstanding.
just their
of another
personality.
culture.
It's not in someone's personality to be a rapist. But, me, I have a personality, I love to hug people. And even if I just meet you, like, expect a hug. So, I mean, if I could go to jail because, you know, someone thought that hugging was inappropriate. Like, that's gonna make me rethink, do I want to be so friendly with people?
I think that's the problem with a lot of like these debates with people. I always at least get the other end of, like, people want to throw out like the extreme examples. What about the murder rapist who like killed 7 little children, girls?
Mm-hmm.
And that's like the example I'll get if I'm saying that they're arguing for Megan's Law. And then the other example, and that's like such another low end, and I think we just look at these like extremes on either end, and I mean, I think it has to be like looked at as a whole, and yeah, there might be like little tiny things that everyone can point that's wrong with it, but if there's so many flaws with this law and it's causing, I mean, we started out with the question, it doesn't make our kids safer. I think it doesn't, and I also think it's wrong. So I have the wrong, it's immoral, and we shouldn't have it view, which it gets really bad reactions. But there's also just if you look at, like, I've not found any proof from any of the articles that I've read or like heard anything about like it's actually gone down. If I have read articles that have argued that crime goes up after Megan's Law, and then it's like causes more problems, and
which is very interesting too, because you can draw an analogy to the death penalty.
Mm-hmm.
Death penalty states actually have more murder in them. There's been no study that has shown that the death penalty deters people from killing other people, but yet audiences cheer Rick Perry when he talks about killing people in the state, whether they're innocent or not. So people are very, very strongly behind the death penalty, even in my classes, and very, very strong behind this, even though, as you say, there's no proof.
Yeah.
So then the question that I put out there is why? If there isn't proof statistically or scientifically that the death penalty works, or that Megan's Law works, then why are we as a nation so in support of it? We keep on passing, as Professor Brooks says, more and more laws. You know, we keep on getting this law and that law, and what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, I think that high-profile cases where children are murdered make bad law. I mean, this not only Megan's Law, but the 3 strikes law, you know, was a reaction to Polly Klaas, who was this little girl in California who was kidnapped and murdered by some guy that had 2 prior convictions. And so as a reaction to that, California passed a law, you know, 3 felonies, you're out, you get life. And that's resulted in people like who steal a video at a video store, you know, ending up with life. So sometimes I think just a reaction, a visceral reaction to danger does often promote some bad laws or some overbroad laws. But what Maureen is saying is I think really interesting. Well, one problem with overbroadness also is just that we don't focus on the really bad people. We tend to focus on too many people, and of course the state police or whoever's and probation officers, whoever have to do all this monitoring, you know, can't look at everybody. And so even district attorneys I know have made the argument that it would be better to just focus on, you know, a subset of the like the tier 3 type offenders. And also what Tricia, you were saying before, I think, is another point. You know, you were arguing that we have issues in our society, but this type of law doesn't necessarily address the bigger issues, and there might be a better way to address those, such as family violence, family sexual assault, and just patriarchy, I guess, that fosters an environment in which women's rights aren't respected, or children's rights aren't respected. That was kind of the argument of Rose Corrigan in her paper, right?
Yeah, she focused more on how the views of the law focus on male-dominated rape and assault, and how they don't look at it as taking rights away from somebody else. They look at it as just a physically violent act. They don't look at it as psychological violence or anything like that. So she was saying, even if there's no evidence of physical violence, it's not treated as seriously as if there was physical violence, but that underestimates psychological violence. Like, people could still experience something like post-traumatic stress disorder and have that like permeate through the rest of their life for things like that. So by classifying it in different ways, I think it puts a different spin on it. Saying that one is more dangerous than another, which they can both still have like effects that are lifelong.
Yeah, I mean, and sometimes it's like levels of penetration become the more serious thing. So there's I mean, indecent assault can also be a much more serious crime. I mean, it can also be like touching someone on their private part. Aggravated indecent assault is touching someone, like penetrating with your finger, okay? And then rape is, penetrating with a penis. Involuntary deviant sexual intercourse is penetration of another body orifice. So there's like the seriousness of the crimes have to do with like things like that are very physical, when in reality indecent assault could actually be a more serious, just as serious in terms of on emotional or psychological level. So.
But if you have a person, just to follow up with that, who's extremely prudish, who just doesn't like being touched, and you kiss them or touch them, maybe on the backside, whatever it may be, no penetration stuff. And they get flipped out. I mean, it's just flipped out subjectively. Should that be factored into the punishment that the defendant gets, where there's no such thing as normal, the usual person would not be so offended?
The eggshell argument.
Yeah.
We should never, I don't think we should ever have our laws based on like the victim's feelings, and I don't think that should go into our lawmaking because it's so skewed. And I think that there's room for that, and I totally agree that with like everything you said, I just don't think that should have I don't see how that affects the law.
So what's another way to deal with it? Like deal with pedophiles who are, did you want somebody?
And I think a way to deal with it is show people compassion and love, and like talk about it and change the way we have this system where it's like reaction, and we're just creating this like circle and cycle. Like how are we going to change anything? How is the crime going to change with what we're doing? We're just perpetuating what's going on right now. I don't have like a perfect like solution, but I definitely don't think that what we have now is right.
See, I don't know if our society is the sort of people who embrace compassion and things like that. When an individual rapes a child, you want to see justice, you want to see punishment for that person. And parents want to be able to know where those people are, so they're able to let their children know, stay away from this person, so they're able to keep tabs on these people. And I understand the issue where some have that stigma on them, and it's awful, and I agree that something maybe should be done. I don't know if the tenure in which they're on this list should be as long as it is, and maybe they should, during that time, be subject to certain counseling and things like that. But overall, I don't see the law disappearing. I think if it would disappear, people would be outraged because of the stigma and like the disgust that they would feel that we don't know where these people are and we can no longer keep tabs on them.
I think I obviously don't think that if you're a sex offender you should just easily get off, but I kind of do agree from like being a psychology major with Maureen that they should have some kind of punishment, and I think parents should have a right to know if their neighbors are sex offenders, but all of the implications that come with it, like you constantly have tabs kept on, you can't do certain things, like it puts them in a really uncomfortable and dangerous position. Like they have to notify employees that they've been convicted as a sex offender, and all of those things kind of put them in a really bad situation. So if you're on the list for 15 years, that's 15 years you're going to have to deal with that, and that's going to have like a lot of psychological side effects.
And actually the 15 years, it's told if you're in jail, that doesn't count as part of the 15 years. So if you serve like 5-10 years in jail, the 15 years starts after you get out.
Why are we letting people out if we like are gonna put them on these restrictions that I believe they'll just lead them right back to at least some sort of crime if we're not helping them or ourselves.
And there's also one thing I didn't mention about SORNA is there's really stiff penalties for violating. So if you fail to report or you fail to notify of a change of address, there's mandatory minimums that apply to that. So 2 to 4 years, 1 to 2 years, I think, then 2 to 4 years, 3 to 6 years. I mean, it's just and then you're talking about very stiff sentences on the second offense. And maybe that's I can understand the rationale that someone isn't going to comply with registering. We want to know, we just want to lock those people up and throw away the key. That's the rationale, and it's not a rationale that you could just dismiss. But I think the overbroadness makes it unfair to many people. So.
Kevin, what's your point of view on this?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know.
You defer to the one. Go ahead.
It's fine.
So I've been thinking while I've been sitting here, and I have this fascination with the brain and like MRIs and scans, and I wonder, can we put these people, like before we send, I don't want to say like send out, but release people with these violent crimes, like there's got to be some kind of a way that we can see, like measure their brain activity to certain stimuli that would include children or rape or like versus tea parties or whatever you want to do, like as your neutral, like an actual tea party, not like crazy. And like see how the difference is and measure that way as to kind of figure out if they're gonna come back.
There have been some studies.
Oh, okay. We'll see there.
And
We're
I
already on a
don't
good
know. I
page.
mean, I really don't know. I just read somewhere in the last day or two. I read that there have been some studies on the brains of, I think, pedophiles, and I think it's made probably very likely in the article that you sent about pedophilia disorder, not a crime, or something like that. It's called. And I think that it demonstrates some kind of like physical difference in the brain to certain kinds of responses and things like that. I don't know the outcome, so I don't want to overstate it. But I think what you're pointing to is part of the, I don't want to say solution, but part of the answer to the question that we have, right? Like what do we do instead? And I think that by just over criminalizing, we end the conversation. And in fact, we need to actually study it and have a conversation, a real conversation, and look at psychological effects. Look at how patriarchal structures actually and gender norms in our society perpetuate these problems. Look at the fact that a lot of sex offenders have been abused before. Like, look at ways to stop the cycle of violence and to stop the silence around this issue, because criminalizing makes us quiet. Like, we think we've done something. If I've looked up on Megan's Law and seen that I have no neighbors immediately that can possibly harm my 4-year-old child, then am I finished? You know what I mean? And if I see that I have one neighbor that is a potential sex offender to my 4-year-old child, then do I, ostracize that person or move, and then am I done? Because I don't think that really solves any problem. I think a lot more needs to go into prevention, and a lot of conversations need to happen about, how these things come about, and we need to talk to our kids too, right? There's a whole other level besides the legal system where we should go, and the legal system should be informed by research and by cultural understanding, especially, you were talking about cultural difference being a big part of the way people interact with each other. That's really important, and our law should be informed by that.
I think it's also interesting that we should look in terms of how we should view pedophiles. We should also look at our past, because how we used to criminalize it is, I learned this in a law and ethics class, is that we used to actually, people who were deemed pedophiles were forced to take medication, which actually took away their sex drive. And I think that is very inhumane, and if we're going to look at it, we shouldn't ever have to alter someone's body and take away something that is completely natural. Whether or not, I don't think being sexually attracted to children is natural, but forcing them to take medication to totally eliminate a sex drive is, in my opinion, like the wrong way to go at things. So I think we should look at the history and go from there, and especially how that affects a person who was forced to take medication, and just that has to have like awful negative effects on that person. And I just think that's
it also kind of treats it like sex rather than violence, which is kind of the argument, that it's. But I mean, I think pedophilia is sort of, in a way, it's a little bit of a different category than sexual violence. So it makes it very confusing and hard to just.
I just had a quick comment to what Trisha said earlier in the conversation about why sexually assaulting or like raping kids like from a stranger standpoint, is more dangerous to a community than from a relative standpoint. I was sitting here thinking, and I kind of want to say that for the community as a whole, a stranger coming in and like doing this to kids, it's more scary for the community versus it happening in your own family, because then that's more scary in your family more than in a whole basis of community setting, because it's not like they're going out and finding random kids. They're doing it in their family, which I mean, it's not okay at all. But at the same time, like, just trying to like make it seem reasonable to like why someone might think like a stranger coming in is more dangerous to the community versus a family member to that child.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly seems scarier to a community.
Just before we wrap up, I just want to make one comment. I think we have to understand the politics of it as well. We want changes have been stated, but in reality, if you were going to run for office for Congress and you say, one of the things I'm going to do is lessen the penalties on pedophiles,
You're not gonna win.
you're not going to win. But you're going to win saying, I'm going to toughen the laws against child molesters or sex offenders and leave the definitions broad. That's going to get you elected.
Yeah.
And that's something we have to consider.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why mandatory minimums, the 3 strikes laws have passed, even though they have questionable effects, at least in the war on drugs and those types of mandatory minimums, just because it's good politics to be tough on crime. I mean, people want to feel safe, but
But they do seem to be based on that kind of visceral mother bear response, you know, rather than something a little bit more objective or empathetic.
so we have just 2 minutes?
2
1
minutes.
minute? Okay, thank you. I just want to thank everyone for the great conversation. Does anyone have any final thoughts about, it's not a question, it's not an issue we can solve at this roundtable, but I think that I really appreciate what Stacy was saying about just having a conversation. I think that's the good first step, to think, let's have a conversation about what's going to make our kids safer. Let's have a conversation about our system of justice and balancing people's rights and public safety. Let's have a conversation about the nature of sex offenses and what that is. So it's good that we had this. It's good to start the conversation at least. So I appreciate everyone's thoughts.
Can I just say thank you for organizing this and also handing out such great material, I think, to all of us. I know I got some great stuff from you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.